One thing that I'm trying to show with this book is that there are lots of non-Greek sources that are very worth the attention of Hellenists.
Welcome to Lesche, a podcast on new ideas in ancient Greek studies. I'm your host, Johanna Hanning, and I'm a classicist at Brown University. I think it's probably fair to say that for a lot of classicists, our knowledge of the interactions and interfaces between early Greek and ancient Near Eastern cultures, mythologies, and literatures probably begins and ends with Martin West's famous book, The East Face of Helicon. And even that might be a generous overstatement. But as Christopher Metcalf points out in our conversation for this episode, West's 1997 book, as remarkable in its scope as it was and as methodologically groundbreaking as it was, prompted a fundamental question. Just what do we actually do with this vast collection of parallels? And in the decades since, scholars have worked to determine which connections genuinely signal historical influence, which might be coincidental, and how and why any of that matters. Christopher's new book, Three Myths of Kingship in Early Greece and the Ancient Near East, takes up these questions by examining specific story patterns that seem to have traveled between Mesopotamia and Greece. His work benefits from his unusual formal training in both classical and Near Eastern languages, a combination that remains institutionally challenging to acquire, as you're going to hear Christopher talk about in our interview. In his book, Christopher examines three mythical paradigms around kingship that connect Greek and Near Eastern traditions. The first is the myth of the servant, where rulers like Sargon, Gyges, and Cyrus rise from subordinate positions to kingship. The second is what Christopher calls the myth of the lover, and this traces the complicated affairs between mortal kings and divine female figures. And then finally, there are narratives of tension between kings and prophetic intermediaries, and that can help us to read Homer and Hesiod in a new light. Our conversation is also going to touch on a Sumerian text in the British Museum that Christopher helped to edit. Initially focused on simply establishing a readable translation of the text as a kind of practice exercise, he only later realized the text's significance for understanding myths about love affairs between royal mortals and divine goddesses, including the relationship between Aphrodite and Anchises depicted in the Homeric hymn. This exemplifies what makes cross-cultural comparisons really productive. They help us to see familiar texts differently. So ultimately, the book, and our conversation, I hope, illuminate the possibilities for future work in this field at the intersections between Greece and the ancient Near East. As Christopher observes, there still remains a vast corpus of Near Eastern texts awaiting fresh analysis by scholars who are willing to cross traditional disciplinary boundaries. And while that path can sometimes be a lonely one, as Christopher points out, it also offers the chance to discover connections that have been hidden in plain sight for centuries and maybe even millennia. Christopher Metcalf is Associate Professor in Classical Literature at the University of Oxford. He is interested in the languages, literatures, and religions of early Greece and the ancient Near East. He grew up in continental Europe and came to the UK to study first classics and then ancient Near Eastern languages. In his research, he enjoys combining detailed philological work with larger-scale comparative studies of literary and religious aspects of the ancient world. He's the author of The Gods Rich in Praise in Early Greek and Mesopotamian Religious Poetry from 2015, Gods and Mortals in Early Greek and Near Eastern Mythology from 2021, and now, most recently, Three Myths of Kingship in Early Greece and the Ancient Near East. Now, just a quick note to say that, as ever, I've put a few references in the show notes for this episode. So now I'd like to welcome into the Lesche Christopher Metcalf. The next voice you'll be hearing is his.
I'd say that the book is a kind of synthesis that ties together different strands from my teaching, but also my research over the last 10, 12 years or so. So some of the chapters come directly from previous research. So for instance, the best example probably is the second chapter, where I talk about a mythical story pattern where a king claims to be king because he has a sexual relationship with love goddess in Mesopotamia, the wider Near East, and in early Greece. And I worked on that first by editing an unpublished Sumerian literary text in the British Museum with a colleague about 10 years ago, which is turned out later to be very relevant to this in ways that I didn't anticipate when I was actually editing the text with the colleague for the first time, because this is a Sumerian literary composition that describes the ups and downs of the king's love affair with the Sumerian goddess Inanna. And at the time when we were editing it, we were just focusing on understanding the text, like on a very basic level, philologically. And then later, when I was lecturing here in Oxford on the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite to students, I would often say at the end of the lecture, well, there is this new text from the British Museum which seems kind of relevant to this whole love story with Anchises and the ups and downs of his relationship with Aphrodite, but I haven't quite worked out how it is relevant. And then a couple of years ago, I got this sabbatical that allowed me to go away and really look at the sources and see what the underlying mythical story pattern actually is and whether it's connected or not. And similarly with the other chapters of the book where I look at other kingship story patterns, they come from a mixture of things that I've looked at in my research, but also things that I do in my undergraduate teaching, lectures and tutorials. So the third chapter, for instance, about myths of tension between kings and other intermediaries of the divine, is mostly comes from my undergraduate tutorials on the Iliad, where it just seemed to me that scholarship was missing quite a big aspect of the Homeric poems. And the first chapter about the myth of the servant, the rise of a new king who is an outsider. Herodotus plays a big role in that. Herodotus 1 on the rise of Gyges and Cyrus, which are also texts that I teach to undergraduates. So yeah, it's a synthesis of my teaching and research interests over the last few years.
Could you speak a little bit about your training? Just because it's still, I think, fairly rare for people to have had training both in ancient Greek and in the Near Eastern languages. And just even structurally, there are barriers. I mean, here at Brown, we have a department of Assyriology and Egyptology, which is kind of an endangered species in some ways. But you would still, as a doctoral student, you would still have to do, the PhD in one and then maybe some sort of MA in the other, but it's unusual. How was it that you were able to get the training in all of these languages?
Well, I suppose, ultimately it goes back to my school days. I grew up in continental Europe. I was lucky to learn Latin in a Catholic school. I was about 10 when I started that. And I didn't like Latin at the time at all. I thought the texts were very boring, and I didn't enjoy Latin literature very much. But then a few years later in Vienna, I was able to start Greek, and that really fascinated me right from the very first lesson. Maybe because I was a bit older, maybe because the textbook that we had was much more engaging. So I knew from when I was maybe like 14, 15 that I wanted to study Greek and learn much more Greek and Greek literature at university. So I did that initially. I studied classics in Edinburgh in Scotland for 4 years, which was great. And I even came to appreciate Latin literature there. And I think it was in the last years of my undergraduate study that I picked up a book by a French scholar who was a scholar but also a great popularizer of the ancient Near East called Jean Bottero. And that book just described how much, first of all, just the fascinating nature of ancient Mesopotamian culture, which has an amazing temporal depth and continuity, but is also quite uniquely a bilingual culture with two quite different linguistic elements. The Sumerian on the one hand, Sumerian is an Isolate language, and Akkadian, which is a Semitic language, on the other hand, and both of these shaped Mesopotamian civilization. And on the other hand, he also described how much material there still is to be just deciphered in museums and private collections, and not to mention all the things that are still in the ground. So that kind of fascinated me, and I then went to Oxford to learn Near Eastern languages. So I knew I wanted to study more, but I didn't want to specialize in classics at that point, just because I had that sensation, that feeling that there is so much else out there that is also worth learning. So I wanted to do that. And it was at some point in the course of doing that I realized that what I was learning on the Near Eastern side could somehow be made fruitful for this debate that Hellenists were having about the extent to which the early Greek poets were borrowing myths and poetic techniques from the ancient Near East. So I applied to the classics faculty here in Oxford to do my doctorate in classics, and well, I'm eternally grateful to them for accepting me. And that then became my first book on religious poetry in early Greece and the ancient Near East. And following that, I worked mainly on the Near Eastern side, especially on unpublished Sumerian literary material. And then, to my surprise, again, I managed to make the move back into classics, and that I understand totally what you mean. That in practically everywhere there are quite rigid institutional boundaries that have developed over time, and it is true, of course, that these different subjects will have their own backgrounds and histories and traditions, and that's fine. But I think it's a pity when these artificial ways of modern organization then become a boundary to exploring the cross-cultural connections that undoubtedly did exist in antiquity, right? So I suppose one thing that I'm trying to show with this book is that there are lots of non-Greek sources that are very worth the attention of Hellenists.
Well, I think for a lot of Hellenists still maybe, and it would be embarrassing to admit, but the last sort of point of reference about interaction between Greek antiquity, early Greek antiquity, and the ancient Near Eastern world would be some, dim memory people have of studying West's east face of Helicon for some qualifying exam or something at some point. Could you maybe speak just a little bit about kind of how things have changed since then? I mean, how you see the interaction between these disciplines, how approaches have changed, maybe even the significance of that moment. Just what's the sort of state of the field?
Well, I mean, West's book from 1997 is an absolutely brilliant piece of work and remains a landmark and point of reference even for specialists working in this field, because he just had this unparalleled knowledge of early Greek poetry, because he edited basically almost all of it, and then he went away and read his way through much of Near Eastern literature, and then wrote an incredible synthesis of all the similarities that he saw. I think the already early responses to West suggested a sense of, well, what do we do with this? So how much it's an accumulation of lots of very detailed observations, but what conclusions can we actually draw from that collection of parallels that West amassed? I think it took quite a long time, but sort of 12, 15 years after that East Face of Helicon appeared, there was then a younger generation of scholars who tried to basically go into detail and first of all establish what parallels are actually significant for indicative of historical influence, and which parallels maybe have to be discarded or interpreted in a different way. And so my doctoral dissertation on religious poetry was sort of part of that endeavor. And there are also other scholars here in Oxford, like Adrian Kelly and Bruno Curry, who contributed a lot to that. I would say how it stands now, I mean, well, in the introduction to my book, I suppose I try to give a bit of a synthesis, and what I try to argue for there is methodological flexibility, right? So there are cases where I think a thorough study of the Near Eastern literary sources and a kind of methodologically informed comparison does yield new arguments and new insights into significant ways in which early Greek authors used Near Eastern story patterns of kingship in my case, right? So there are new connections to be made there. And that explained just very straightforwardly what kinds of materials early Greek authors were drawing on and how they were reshaping it creatively. In other cases, it's more that looking at something in the Near East makes you see sort of similarities and differences that are just kind of thought-provoking, and that help you maybe to see familiar material on the Greek side in a slightly different way, without there being any kind of historical connection. But if all you ever study is one thing, like Greek literature, then you might assume that many things are just natural and have to be the way they are because that's all that you're familiar with. And reading something from a neighboring culture can be stimulating in getting you to think actually how it could also be different, for instance. Yeah. So a kind of more open-ended comparativism. So this is also something that I try to do in the third chapter of my book, where I talk about story patterns of tensions between kings and priests, prophets, seers, and things like that in Mesopotamia, in the Hebrew Bible, in early Greece. Not suggesting any kind of historical influence in that particular case, but still looking at a theme that is very prominent in Mesopotamia and the Bible can help us to perceive something about early Greek epic in that case that we might otherwise not have picked up. Yeah. So I think it's important in this area not to, well, I don't like broad generalizations and saying, this is how it was. And I think I prefer to proceed through kind of case studies so that you have a kind of mosaic of individual examples. And I don't think that all of the evidence is always going to necessarily point in the same direction. So that's how I see the sort of state of the comparative enterprise, and that's how I see also for the future. Having more of these detailed case studies basically will then one day maybe enable us to come up with a sort of bigger synthesis. But I think at the moment we're still sort of trying to work out what exactly we can say and not say.
So still sort of data collection in a way.
Yeah, so on Homer and Gilgamesh, there's a vast literature already, but there's this tendency, as often in scholarship, that a lot of people talk about the same kinds of stuff. But one of the things about the ancient Near East is that there is a vast amount of textual material out there, much of which is actually not that well known, maybe because it's not so accessible. And so one route for the future, I think, is also to look at these sort of less trodden paths, and there are all kinds of things that one can still find out there, I think, if one looks beyond the stuff that is kind of already very familiar.
Maybe before we move into the three main case studies of the book, I would be curious to hear your account of what it was like for you to broaden from classics into the ancient Near Eastern material, given precisely what you were just saying, that there some of the traditions and habits of publication are different in the fields based around ancient Near Eastern literatures, and that there isn't the same kind of commentary tradition that is so fundamental and I think taken for granted in classics. I mean, how does one even access these texts, and what kind of apparatus are there for using them to aid readers in even approaching them?
Yeah, well, there's a spectrum. So some of the best known texts on the ancient Near Eastern side do have editions and commentaries that are kind of comparable to what you would have for major works of Greek literature. But there's not many examples of that. I mean, the sort of shining example would be Andrew George's 2003 edition, text and commentary, and it's a very full literary commentary of the Gilgamesh epic. But that's an exception. So many other texts are, if there are scholarly editions of them, those editions will be probably focused on just establishing the text and a translation on a kind of quite basic level. This is true especially of Sumerian literature, which because Sumerian is an isolate language and for a number of other reasons is just challenging to grasp on a quite elementary level. There will also be many cases where a text has actually never been edited, so that means that there is no scholarly transliteration and translation and commentary on it, and it's just published as a so-called hand copy, meaning as a drawing of the tablet. Another problem with editions is that they're often outdated. So if an edition of a Sumerian literary text was done in the 1980s or 90s, then it's sure to be outdated by now, and then there will be additional fragments that have come to light since then which you then, if you want to, access the text as fully as possible, you will then have to track those fragments down and see where they fit into the older edition and so on. So there's a lot of spade work that you need to do. That it's not just you can just reach into the shelf for an OCT basically. But there are now online resources that are kind of remedying this, right? So for Akkadian literature, there's the excellent electronic Babylonian library, which is run by a team in Munich, which gives the most up-to-date texts and translations of things like Gilgamesh, so incorporating so also in the case of Gilgamesh, for instance, since Andrew George's 2003 edition, lots of new stuff has come to light. For instance, the opening lines of the epic. So in the 2003 edition, the opening is actually not quite there, whereas more recently published materials have given us actually the first line. So online resources are now offering the possibility of sort of updatable corpora, but those will generally not include commentaries either. So this is part of the in ancient Near Eastern studies we also don't have that many people, so it's not like one person can do an edition of the text and then some years later someone will write like a green and yellow commentary on it or something like that. It's just the manpower is not there. I know classics often feel kind of precarious in terms of its institutional position, but in ancient Near Eastern studies, this is really magnified. It really is a very small number of people faced with a very large corpus, including lots and lots of potential for work on texts of all kinds, but including literature.
Just because I think this comparison even between the scholarly traditions and practices and habits is really interesting, could you maybe just walk us through what you did to edit the text that was in the British Museum? I mean, how did that become known to you? What was your process? Where did you publish it?
Well, so at the time, I was just finishing my doctoral dissertation, which was, like I said, on religious poetry, comparative study with early Greece. And I was then invited by a colleague in Tübingen to contribute to the edition of a quite large group of unpublished Sumerian literary texts in a Norwegian collection, the Skøyen collection. And my Tübingen colleague ended up assigning me the sort of religious poems, hymns and prayers that were part of that corpus that he was in charge of. And I thought that as a preparation, I should probably have a go at practicing on unpublished Sumerian literary manuscripts. So I asked my colleague Marie-Christine Ludwig, who teaches Sumerian literature here in Oxford, if she could point me towards anything in the British Museum, which is obviously closer to here than Norway. And so she ended up showing me this text in the British Museum, which was known to Sumerologists. It had been mentioned in sort of catalogues and inventories of tablets in the British Museum. And several scholars had looked at it, but nobody had ever published it. The reason is because there are all kinds of reasons, but one reason is that it's in a so-called microscript. So it's actually a beautifully preserved, quite legible tablet, but it's in very, very small writing. So my colleague, Dr. Ludwig, showed me this tablet and said, well, why don't you try this? And then I tried to transliterate it, and Dr. Ludwig had also made her own transliteration decades ago when she was a graduate student. And then in the end, we said, well, why don't we just try to publish it? So we published it with a commentary that is more interpretative than usual in ancient Near Eastern studies, and that's part of my classical background, I think. But it was really mainly focused on just establishing philologically, what the text actually says. And as I said, it was only much later, well, not much later, but several years later, that it dawned on me that this text could actually be quite important for a comparison with analogous myths of kingship in early Greece. That wasn't really clear to me at the point when I was working on the tablet. And well, we published it in one of the standard journals in ancient Near Eastern studies, so the Zeitschrift für Assyriologie. Yeah, so in that sense, it's like in classics. But yeah, that's the history of that.
I guess the last thing before we get into the Three Myths of Kingship is, could you maybe just give a quick overview of, in your introduction, you define some terms And I think it would be useful for listeners to know how you're defining myth.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, that is obviously important. I mean, the first thing, and this is really vital, is that as others have pointed out, but as is seemingly not universally realized, myth is really not the same as a text. So the best way, I think, to look at myth is to see it as a story in a kind of abstract sense, which can be represented in different media. So it can be represented in a text, or in a work of art, or a piece of music, a dance. But the myth and the text, or the myth and the medium, is not the same thing. They need to be kept apart. The second thing is that a myth generally can be sort of reconstructed as a sequence of events. And what is characteristic of, and this comes out in the book as well, of the more ambitious writers cross-culturally, is that they tend not to give you every single possible segment of the story, of the mythical story pattern, but they tend to be selective, right? So you can see this already in Homer's treatment of the Trojan War. You can observe this in Greek tragedy, that poets generally zoom in on certain segments of the story pattern and underplay or even eliminate others, right? So this is part of their creative process. And I suppose the third thing that is kind of consistently observable about myths is that they tend to be set in the past and involve significant interactions between divine and mortal characters, and often they're etiological, so they're basically stories set in some sort of past that explain something important about the present. So those would be, I think, three important features of myth. I'm not claiming that as a general theory of myth, but just for the kinds of times and places that I'm talking about in the book.
Yeah, I think it's helpful as an orientation for your case studies. Well, maybe you could then, if we jump into them, begin with the myth of the servant. So what do you mean by that? And what are the texts you mentioned? The Herodotus is an important point for that. But yeah, maybe you could just speak a little bit about the myth of the servant.
Sure. I mean, the myth of the servant is a story pattern that, as I see it, was used in various cultures in the Near East and the East Mediterranean to explain the rise of a newcomer. So this seems to have happened in different times and places throughout history, that a new person comes along who's not of royal descent himself, but who founds a powerful royal dynasty of his own or her own. And the first example of that is Sargon in the late 3rd millennium of Mesopotamia. And quite early on, in the early 2nd millennium BC, we get Sumerian literary compositions that describe his background and his rise to power. And the essence of the myth of the servant, the reason I call it the myth of the servant, is that at the center of the story, you have the notion that the future king, who did not come from any royal lineage, served in some kind of subordinate position in the household of an existing king who is usually fictional. And then what happens is that the servant becomes king and takes the position of his master. And you can tell that in lots of different ways. So basically for Sargon, the essence of the fundamental elements of the story pattern is that the future ruler is born in some kind of situation of tension. Basically, he wasn't supposed to be born, and then he becomes separated from his parents. That can be through exposure, or it can be through other means. But he is then raised by somebody else, not his natural parents, and that somebody else happens to be an attendant in a palace. And so the protagonist is taken in by this person, is raised by him, and the protagonist then himself becomes a servant in the palace. So in Sargon's case, in my reconstruction, he started off on the outside of the palace as a gardener, and then later he was kind of promoted and became cupbearer in the service of a king called Urzababa in the city of Kish, and we have no evidence that Urzababa ever existed. And then in the end, and for Sargon we don't have the full textual evidence for that, but in the end Sargon somehow supplanted was a Baba with the support of the gods and became king himself. And so on the human level, with mortal kings, that a story pattern is then replicated very closely in the case of Cyrus the Great, especially in the version of Ctesias in the Persika, which basically follows the story pattern exactly in the way that I've described it. Herodotus in Histories 1 also follows this story pattern, but varies it in an important way, because in Herodotus we have the tensions at birth. So Cyrus wasn't really supposed to be born in the first place, and he is separated from his parents through exposure. But then what Herodotus doesn't do is he doesn't make Cyrus, well, so Cyrus is taken in by a royal herdsman, and so that also follows what we have with Sargon. He's taken in by a royal lieutenant, but the point is there that Cyrus doesn't become a royal servant himself, so he doesn't become an attendant in the court of Astyages. What Herodotus does instead is that he transfers the role of the disloyal servant to Harpagos, the steward of Astyages, the king. And it is actually that Astyages who then orchestrates the revolt of the Persians against the Medes and Cyrus's deposing of Astyages and Cyrus's accession to kingship. What I find interesting about that is that Herodotus actually openly acknowledges, in my view, at the end of his Cyrus narrative, his dependence on the simpler version of the story, as told by Ctesias, where Cyrus is actually Astyages' attendant and ends up getting rid of him. Because at the end of Herodotus's Cyrus narrative, or the rise of Cyrus, Herodotus has a scene where Harpagos, the disloyal steward, and the deposed king Astyages are in conversation. And the first thing that Harpagos asks Astyages, the former king, is, well, how is it for you to have gone from king to nobody? And that's exactly at the heart of the myth of the servant, that you have the reversal from servant to king. But as I said in Herodotus, the point is that it's actually not Harpagos, the disloyal steward, who became king himself. It's Cyrus. And that's exactly what the first thing that Astyages says to Harpagos. Well, how can it? You must be a fool, because if you really orchestrated this whole thing, then why did you give the kingship to someone else, namely Cyrus? Yeah, that's exactly Herodotus drawing attention to that crucial variation that he introduces into his version of Cyrus's rise, compared to the simpler version that Ctesias had. And the reason why Herodotus varied the story pattern in the case of Cyrus, I think, is simply that he had already used that crucial idea of reversal between the servant and the king previously at the very beginning of Book 1 in his tale of Lydian kingship, which is his first logos of Lydian kingship. And there he has Gyges, the founder of a new dynasty in Lydia, being the spear bearer of Candaules, an existing king who is probably fictional, for whom we have no evidence. And Gyges then straightforwardly takes the place of Candaules and becomes king in his stead and begins a new dynasty. So I think it's because Herodotus had already... So there I find it significant that in his very first logos of Near Eastern kingship, Herodotus is using that central bit of the myth, the reversal between king and servant, and the rise of the servant to kingship. And so that's also why I think he's then not recycling it in the Cyrus story, but is changing it around slightly.
I mean, that's an interesting example for many reasons, but in part because Herodotus has not repurposed this myth to talk about a Greek king, or say it's not that it's been sort of imported into the Greek tradition, but rather, I mean, he is actually repeating it about, in a historical framework, about a Near Eastern ruler, let's say. And then in the Greek tradition, Cyrus just becomes so famous. I mean, we have the Cyropaedia, and actually for a seminar I'm teaching right now, we're reading Isocrates' Evagrius today, in which Isocrates says, everybody's so obsessed with Cyrus and how great he was, but I want to encomiase somebody else. So what sort of light does this story and Herodotus' use of it maybe shed on the channels of transmission of these kinds of stories?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question, and one that I don't really engage with in the book, to be honest, because space was a little bit sort of limited, and I wanted to focus on the evidence of the texts without worrying too much about the mechanisms of transmission. I mean, I think I think it's pretty likely that something like the original form of the story pattern, as we have it with Sargon, survived in a Mesopotamian and then Persian context into the first millennium, and that Ctesias picked it up and adapted it quite straightforwardly to Cyrus. I think that Herodotus must have known the story pattern as well, whether it's through his. I mean, he claims that he heard the Cyrus story through reliable Persian informers. Well, he must have been somehow in contact with Persian sources, I think, for the story pattern, but he engaged with it pretty freely. It's true that it retains its sort of Eastern context, right? And I have an epilogue to the chapter where I talk about what I call the myth of the servant and the notion of the ruler exposed at birth, right? Because this is something which scholarship has seized on more strongly. The idea that lots of royal figures in the Near East and in the Mediterranean world were somehow exposed when they were small. So we have that with Sargon, we have it with Moses, with Oedipus, with Romulus and Remus, and so on. And that's not wrong, but it's only part of the comparison. So as I try to show, the more fundamental idea is that the ruler is born in a situation of tension and is then separated from his parents and is then taken in by someone else who happens to be a palace attendant. And exposure is just one of the ways in which you can effect that separation. What's interesting is that in the Greek kingship stories that use exposure and that revolve around Greek rulers, it seems that the exposure is really the thing that they concentrate on, and they don't generally make much use of the idea that the future ruler was then also a servant of some imaginary existing king. So in the Oedipus story, for instance, we don't really have that. And I speculate that that's because that element of reversal sort of within the palace from servant to king is maybe something which worked better in the kind of palatial context of the ancient Near Eastern world, right, and was just not something which is so productive in a Greek setting, although there are still traces of it. So in the Ion, for instance, in Euripides' Ion, which follows this story pattern that I try to reconstruct very closely, we still have this idea of Ion being separated, taken in, and then being a kind of lowly servant before he becomes promoted to king. But the point is that Euripides sets that in the temple of Apollo, not in a palace. So a sort of something a more familiar setting, perhaps in a Greek tragedy. Even with Oedipus, if you look at the Oedipus Rex, the idea of anxiety about Oedipus's sort of possible servile origins is still there. He says that Jocasta, the reason Jocasta doesn't want him to find out the truth is because she's worried that she might have married someone who was of servile origin or something like that. So there is still a trace there, but it's not so strong and not so productive. That would be something that would be worth investigating, in more detail later. I was focusing in the book more on the historical accounts.
Right. Well, we could maybe then move into the next one where you have the myth of the lover. We have this case of the goddess and the herdsman, where you have a very interesting reading of the hymn to Aphrodite in this context. So maybe you could just give a little bit of an overview of that mythical paradigm.
Yeah. So the basic idea there is that the mortal ruler claimed to be the lover of in the Near East, a very powerful goddess called Inanna or Ishtar. And in being that lover, the king basically became Inanna Ishtar's divine lover, who is called Dumuzi, a shepherd figure. And we have lots and lots of sort of mythological narrative, but also other kinds of texts from the ancient Near East that revolve around this relationship between Inanna and Dumuzi. And we have a smaller number, but also some very significant ones, like the one in the British Museum that I talked about earlier, which transfer that relationship between Inanna and Dumuzi to Inanna and a named mortal king whom we actually know existed from documentary sources. And I think the first thing that I tried to show in the chapter of the book is that if you look at the different Sumerian and some Akkadian sources together, you can see that the story wasn't just about the marriage and the sexual union. It was actually a story pattern, like I was saying earlier. As characteristic of myths, it moves through several stages, but not every text will give you the full story pattern. In fact, most texts just focus on a few segments that are most interesting and relevant for the purposes of that text. And basically, the fullest version of the story pattern is that you have the preparations of the marriage between either Dumuzi or the mortal king, which tends to involve the parents of Inanna. And then you have the marriage and its consummation, and it is clearly a marriage. So they are, meant to be sort of permanently joined.
It's not just a one-night stand.
Not just a one-night stand, that's right. But then what happens next is that the male partner messes up in some way, commits a transgression. That could be adultery, for instance. And that then attracts the punishment of the gods. So either Inanna herself gets angry, or her father, the chief god Enlil, or her grandfather, the chief god Enlil, does it. And then that leads to punishment and lament. So the male lover, Dumuzi, or the king, gets punished in some way, and then he or his relatives, including sometimes Inanna herself, mourn over his sad fate. And that then prepares the way for the final element of the myth, which is a sort of conciliatory ending, as I call it, where somehow there's a sort of rebalancing and things become more positive in some way. And so the first thing that I try to do in the book is to establish that kind of narrative arc, which had already been seen by earlier scholars, but we now have more. So it was time now for a new working through of the evidence, because as I was saying, on the Near Eastern side, new textual evidence basically comes out every year. And in fact, since I wrote the book, quite important new material that I haven't been able to take into account has actually been published. So it was just to establish the story pattern, then also to study its transmission in the wider ancient Near East, and to establish that it didn't just exist in the 3rd and early 2nd millennium, which is when most of the Sumerian literary sources come from, but that actually had a lasting influence within Mesopotamia into the 1st millennium, and also spread to the wider ancient Near East. That was the second thing. And then the third thing was to look at its transmission to early Greece, where it comes up in connection with Cuneiform of Cyprus, and then Anchises of Troy. And again, previous scholars had seen that, there's something there with this idea that Anchises is a sort of herdsman, but also a king, and he has this affair with the love goddess, and there's an elaborate sort of adornment scene, and then a lovemaking scene, and that does sort of look quite similar to this, Sumerian material from the early 2nd millennium. But previously, as often, it wasn't that clear, like what to do with that, and especially also how to bridge the gap in time and the geographical gap between these quite disparate sources. And so what I tried to show in the chapter is, first of all, that the story pattern is actually basically the same. So it's not just these elements of the sexual union preceded by a sort of adornment. It's actually the full arc is there, because we also have the transgression, punishment, lament, and conciliation elements in connection with Anchises and with Cuneiform. But also that the mythical story pattern was quite well known within the ancient Near East and Mesopotamia well into the 1st millennium, so that makes it easier to understand how it could have been adopted by the early Greek poets. But again, there it's interesting that I find that so far as I can see, the best evidence for this story pattern in Greece is with figures who were part of Greek mythology, but were sort of not central to it. Cyprus, Troy, and the Troad. So it retained that kind of Eastern flavor. There's then a whole sequel that you could write if you wanted to about how this all travels to Rome.
Right. Thereby rendering Latin literature interesting.
Yes, exactly. So finally, but again, that just ended up being an epilogue, and I hope someone else will do it.
Well, I don't want to give the entire book away, and I hope people turn to it just because it is so rich and textured. But maybe you could just say a few sentences then about your last paradigm, which is slightly different, and which emphasizes, that these stories are not told by the kings, but rather by people in their ambit who maybe have their own agenda.
Yeah. Early Greek poetry, especially, given the prominence that it has in Iliad 1, if you think of the ways in which Agamemnon manages to offend first the priest Chryses and then also threatens and insults Chalcias the seer. So basically what I try to show is that was a very productive theme in Homer and also in Hesiod, because Hesiod is also that kind of divinely inspired speaker legitimized by the muses who sets himself up in opposition to the basileis of his time. So yeah, that is a story pattern that rather gives legitimacy to those who oppose the kings and perhaps has a kind of didactic function. I think that Homer and Hesiod, identified with these kinds of figures because of the affinities of poetry and prophecy in the Greek mind, and maybe their poems were in part sort of warnings to these leaders.
Well, it nicely continues on, I think, your second case study, the goddess and herdsman, or the lover paradigm, just because that one had showed us that kings do make mistakes.
Yeah, that's right, exactly.
Well, I guess I would hope to end by asking you, what would you say to a postgraduate student in classics, or maybe an undergraduate finishing up a classics degree, who might be interested in exploring this kind of material but just doesn't know where to start, or is maybe intimidated by it all? It could be something so simple as just like a book you would recommend, or a language you would recommend, or a...
Well, so for Near Eastern, if you want to access Near Eastern literature, then Akkadian will be the most immediate way to do that. Ideally through studying it somewhere at university, but for Akkadian there are even good like self-help, self-teaching books like Martin Worthington's brilliant Complete Babylonian, like on the model of Complete Italian or Complete French, there's Complete Babylonian. And beyond that, I would say, once you've maybe developed some sort of facility in the language, maybe try to branch out and look for things that haven't been talked about in detail yet. I like in the case of the book that I tried to write, it just seemed to me that the evidence was hidden in plain sight. Really, mm-hmm. It was not, like the argument of my book is not complicated. I hope. I think it's easy to. I hope it's relatively easy to follow, mm-hmm. and just emerges quite naturally from a sort of straightforward mm-hmm. reading of the sources. So, I would imagine that there's a lot more out there of similar work that could be done along similar lines, just by looking around more widely, and not talking again and again about the same text that everybody's been talking about.
Well, you said that even when you were an undergraduate, you had this hunch that things had not been discussed that were worthy of looking into, and you followed that hunch, and here we are 3 books later or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. So follow your instincts as well. Mm-hmm. that that's very important. It can be a bit lonely, doing this kind of thing, and people ask you, so what are you working on, and then you tell them, and it's like, okay, this is kind of weird, but I'm sure that there's really a lot. It feels in a way like a lot has been written about this topic already, and because there is also already obviously a rich tradition of scholarship before West and Burkert and these great figures. But at the same time, it feels to me like there's just a huge amount that remains to be done, and so in a way, it's only really just beginning.
Well, thank you, Christopher. I was hoping we could end with the signature podcast word association game.
Okay.
Are you ready?
Yep.
Okay. So just whatever comes to mind first. So kingship.
Pantame bulu kratein. Oedipus Rex.
Myth of succession.
Reversal.
Okay. Cyrus the Great.
Empire builder.
Cuneiform.
Key to the stars.
Inanna.
Aphrodite, but bigger.
Well, great. Perfect. Christopher, thank you so much. It was great to have you on the podcast, and congratulations on the book.
Thank you. Thank you, Anna. It's great to meet you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Lesche podcast. And special thanks for their support of the podcast to the Brown University Department of Classics and the John Nicholas Brown Center for Advanced Study. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. And we'd be grateful if you take a moment to rate the podcast and leave a review. It will help other listeners to find us. We look forward to you joining us again soon here in the Lesche.